Blood is thicker than water. But what if loyalty crosses the line into darkness? Eleanor Vance faces a brother turned outlaw and a ranch on the brink of ruin. Every heartbeat, every decision is a gamble. Protect the innocent or shield the guilty? And when the bullets fly, the true measure of family is revealed. If Eleanor's courage moved you, comment, share, and subscribe for more stories of love, conflict, and survival in the West.
Summer in Wyoming territory didn't forgive. It just baked the earth till it cracked. Then it blew the dust right into your eyes. It was 1878. Sweetwater Ridge was a town built on cattle, sweat, and cruel rumors. And Abigail Lawson knew plenty about the rumors. Most folks just called her Abby, or, when they thought she couldn't hear, that crazy widow. Abby wrung out her rag over the tin bucket. The lye soap stung her cracked knuckles. She didn't mind the sting. It kept her awake, kept her focused. She scrubbed the wooden steps of the general store until the grain showed clean. Behind her, the town moved in a loud, dusty blur. Wagons rattled. Horses whinnied. Cowboys shouted over the noise of the saloon across the street. Abby kept her head down. She always kept her head down. Men were unpredictable, like loose dynamite. 10 years she had survived her husband, a decade of bruised ribs, of locked doors. The man had been a walking storm. When a spooked horse finally threw him and broke his neck, the town mourned a good drinker. Abby just breathed. For the first time in her adult life, she took a full breath. Now, she took odd jobs, scrubbing floors, mending shirts, mucking stalls. The town women looked at her with pity. A woman of 38, barren, alone, and quiet. To them, she was a ghost haunting her own life. She preferred it that way. Ghosts didn't get hit. The sun dipped low. It painted the Wyoming sky in bruised shades of purple and burnt orange. Abby dried her hands on her apron. She picked up her bucket. The store owner flipped a silver coin onto the counter. He didn't look her in the eye. She took the coin, nodded, and walked out. She didn't head toward the boarding house. She walked the other way. Past the saloons, past the livery stable, out toward the dry, rolling scrublands. The wind picked up. It howled through the sagebrush. Abby pulled her shawl tight. She checked over her shoulder once. Twice. The road behind her was empty. Just dust and shadows. 2 miles out of town stood an old line shack. It was a forgotten thing. The wood was rotted gray. The roof sagged in the middle. The wind whistled through the wide gaps in the timber. It wasn't a place for a living soul. Abby approached it carefully. Her boots made no sound on the hard-packed dirt. She pushed the heavy wooden door. It groaned on rusted hinges. Inside, it was dark, and it was cold. Even in the dead heat of July, the shack held a damp chill. Abby struck a match. The sudden flare lit up her tired face. She touched the flames to a small oil lantern on a broken table. The yellow light pushed back the shadows. In the corner of the room sat a wooden apple crate. It was lined with thick sheepskin and faded quilts. A sound came from the crate. A soft, tiny whimper. A cry in the dark. Abby's shoulders dropped. The tension of the town, the fear, the hiding melted away. She walked over and sank to her knees in the dirt. She reached her hands into the soft blankets. She pulled out a tiny bundle. Clara, 8 months old. Bright, curious eyes. 10 tiny fingers that immediately grabbed at the worn fabric of Abby's dress. There wasn't a single drop of Abby's blood in the child's veins, but to Abby, that didn't matter, not one bit. "Hush now, I'm here," Abby murmured. Her voice was raspy from a long day of silence. She pulled a small corked bottle of goat's milk from her satchel. She had traded her last bit of mending money for it. She held the bottle to Clara's lips. The baby drank greedily. Abby rocked the child. The lantern light flickered, casting long, dancing shadows on the rotted walls. Outside, the coyotes began to sing. Inside, there was only the quiet rhythm of the baby breathing. Abby looked down at the little girl. Clara was a secret, a dangerous one. If the town knew who this child belonged to, who her biological father was, they would tear her away. They would give her back to a monster. Abby stopped rocking. She pulled the baby back, just enough to look into those wide, innocent eyes. The silence in the room felt heavy. It needed to be broken. The truth needed to be spoken out loud, even if it was just to an infant. "They talk, Clara," Abby said. Her voice was firm now. "Clear. The whole town talks. This society tells us a woman is only valuable if she can breed heirs for a man. They think we are just vessels, just property to be traded, used, and discarded." Clara cooed, reaching up to touch Abby's cheek. Abby caught the tiny hand and kissed the knuckles. "But I tell you this, little one," Abby continued, her words ringing with a fierce, absolute certainty. "Our true worth lies in preserving our humanity in a cruel world. Every human life has a right to be cherished, not owned. A human being is never property. We have the fundamental right to be free, to be equal, and to be safe." She pulled the baby tight against her chest. The wind hammered against the shack, but Abby didn't shiver. "The law might say you belong to a man who only wants to use you," Abby whispered into the dark room. "But the law is wrong, and I will fight the whole world to make sure you know it." 6 months earlier, the winter of '77, it was a cruel winter, the kind that froze the water in the wash basins overnight, the kind that killed cattle where they stood in the fields. Abby worked at the Sullivan House back then. It was a grand place. 3 stories of painted timber. Glass windows shipped all the way from Chicago. It looked like a palace. It felt like a tomb. Margaret Sullivan ran that house with an iron fist. She cared about 2 things: money and reputation. She had a daughter, Cora, was 20, soft-spoken, gentle. She liked to press wildflowers into thick books. She had a laugh like a silver bell. Then Silas Montgomery came around. Silas owned the biggest spread in the territory. He had money, he had men. He took what he wanted, and he never asked permission. He wanted Cora. Cora said no. Silas didn't care. Abby remembered the night it happened. The house was quiet. Margaret was away in Denver. Abby heard the screams from the parlor. She ran. She was too late. Silas was walking out, buttoning his coat. He flipped a gold coin onto the hallway table. He looked at Abby. His eyes were flat, dead. "Clean up the mess," he said. That was all. No guilt, no fear. He was the law in Sweetwater Ridge. Cora was never the same. The silver bell laugh was gone. She grew quiet, pale. Then her belly began to swell. Margaret came back from Denver. She saw the girl. She didn't offer a shoulder to cry on. She slapped Cora across the face. Hard. "You've ruined us," Margaret hissed. "Silas Montgomery will never marry damaged goods, and no one else will either." They hid Cora away, locked her in the upstairs bedroom. They told the town she had consumption, a lung disease, highly contagious, no visitors. For months, Abby carried up trays of food: broth, bread, tea. Cora barely ate. She just stared out the frosty window. Her hands rested on her swollen stomach. "It's not the baby's fault," Cora whispered one snowy afternoon. "It's a piece of heaven, trapped in a piece of hell." Abby just nodded. She brushed the girl's hair. She didn't have any words. Words didn't fix things like this. Then came the night of the storm. The wind screamed around the eaves of the big house. It sounded like dying animals. Cora's water broke. The labor was hard, violent. Cora was too frail, too broken. She bled. She screamed until her voice was gone. Abby ran for hot water. She brought clean sheets. She begged Margaret to send a rider for the doctor in town. Margaret stood in the doorway. Her face was set like stone. "No doctor," Margaret said. A doctor means a birth record. It means questions. When the thing is born, wrap it up. Silas already sent word. He said to drown it in the creek. Or leave it for the wolves. He doesn't want the evidence walking around. Abby froze. The copper bowl of warm water shook in her hands. Ma'am, you can't mean that. It's your blood. It is Silas Montgomery's bastard, Margaret snapped, and it will destroy this family's good name. You do as you are told, Abby, or you'll be out in the snow with them. Margaret turned and walked down the hall. Abby walked into the room. Cora lay on the soaked bed. Her skin was the color of old parchment, but in her arms, wrapped in a blood-stained blanket, was a baby, a little girl. The baby wasn't crying. She was just looking up, dark, quiet eyes. Cora was breathing shallow, quick, rattling breaths. She looked at Abby. Take her, Cora whispered. Abby set the water bowl down. She moved to the bed. Cora, let me clean you. Let me try to stop the bleeding. Too late. Cora shook her head. A tear slid down her pale cheek. She pushed the bundle toward Abby. Take her. Run. Don't let my mother have her. Don't let Silas find her. Abby's hands trembled. She took the warm, tiny bundle. The baby weighed almost nothing. Cora reached out. Her fingers were ice cold. She gripped Abby's wrist with a sudden, desperate strength. Her eyes locked onto Abby's. The dying girl pulled herself up an inch. She needed Abby to hear this, really hear it. Listen to me, Abby, Cora gasped. Her voice was weak, but the words were carved from iron. The law says she is the property of the monster who ruined me. The law says a man owns his seed, no matter how he planted it. But the law is an abomination. I need you to teach her the truth. Abby nodded, tears finally spilling hot down her cheeks. I will. I promise. Say it, Cora demanded, her grip tightening. You have to teach her. Tell her that she is a free human being. Tell her that every person has equal rights under God, not under men. A child is not an object for a man to control. A child is not a piece of property to be discarded to save a reputation. Cora fell back against the pillows. She gasped for air. Teach her human rights. Tell her she belongs to herself. Promise me, Abby, swear it. I swear it, Abby cried. I swear it on my soul, Cora. She is not property. She is a free human being. Cora smiled. It was a small, broken thing, but it was peaceful. She closed her eyes. She let go of Abby's wrist. Her chest stopped moving. The room was dead silent, just the wind outside. Abby didn't have time to mourn. She heard footsteps on the stairs, heavy boots. Margaret S. Foreman. He was coming to do Silas' dirty work. Abby moved fast. Survival instinct took over. She stripped off her heavy wool apron. She wrapped the baby in it twice around. She tied the bundle tight against her chest. She grabbed her thick winter coat and pulled it on, buttoning it over the baby. She looked like a heavier woman. Nothing more. She slipped out the servant's door at the back of the bedroom. She hurried down the narrow, dark stairs, through the kitchen. Out the back door, the cold hit her like a hammer. The wind nearly knocked her down. She didn't stop. She ran. She waded through the knee-deep snow. Her boots grew heavy. Her lungs burned. She didn't look back at the big house. She just kept moving toward the tree line, toward the empty scrublands. The town, thought Cora, died of consumption that night. They held a closed casket funeral. Margaret Sullivan wore expensive black lace and cried perfect silent tears. Silas Montgomery stood in the back of the church. He looked bored. Nobody asked about the baby. Nobody knew there was one. Except Abby. She hid in the abandoned line shack. She huddled under rotted blankets. She kept the baby against her bare skin to keep them both from freezing. She fed the child sugar water and snow melt until she could sneak into town to buy milk. She didn't steal a baby. She took a dying mother's last prayer. She took a promise. And out there in the freezing dark, listening to the tiny heart beating against her own, Abby swore she would keep it. The seasons turned. The brutal winter melted into a muddy spring. Then summer baked the mud into dust. Now autumn was creeping in. The mornings were getting sharp again. Abby needed steady work. The line shack was draft-atty. Clara was getting bigger. 8 months old now. She needed warm clothes, no, real food. That was how she ended up at the Sterling Ranch. Josiah Sterling was a different kind of man. He was tall, broad-shouldered, hands calloused from ropes and reins. But he had a quieter way about him. He didn't yell at his cowhands. He didn't drink himself blind at the saloon. He lived in a massive, sprawling ranch house. 2 stories, wraparound porch, real glass windows, just like the Sullivans. But this house didn't feel like a tomb. It just felt empty. 5 years ago, a spooked team of horses dragged a wagon over an embankment. Josiah lost his wife and his young son. Since then, he just worked. Dawn to dusk, he hired Abby to keep the house, cooking, cleaning, washing. The pay was good, very good, but it created a problem, a terrifying problem. The hours were long. Abby to leave before the sun came up. She didn't get back to the line shack until after dark. She couldn't leave Clara alone that long. Not anymore. The baby was starting to crawl. She could get hurt. She could freeze, so Abby made a desperate choice. She started smuggling Clara into the Sterling house. It was a risky game, a game of inches and seconds. Every morning before the ranch woke up, Abby walked the 2 miles. She carried a large woven laundry basket. Under the piled sheets and work shirts, Clara slept. Abby would sneak through the back door. She would put the basket in the warm corner of the massive kitchen, right near the cast iron stove. Clara was a quiet baby. Maybe she knew. Maybe she sensed the danger. She rarely fussed. When she did, Abby was there with a bottle or a soft song. Josiah was rarely in the house during the day. He rode the fences, checked the herds. Bookkeeping in his study with the door closed. It worked. For 3 weeks it worked. Then came a Tuesday in late October. The sky was the color of bruised iron. A cold rain lashed against the windows. Josiah didn't ride out. He stayed in his study. Abby was a knot of nerves. She scrubbed the parlor floor, keeping one ear toward the kitchen. She wore her best work dress. It was dark wool, heavy. It had a wide hoop skirt beneath it, holding the fabric out like a bell. It was old-fashioned, but it was warm. Around noon, she heard it. A squeak, a rustle. Then a distinct babbling coo from the kitchen. Clara was awake, and she was unhappy. Abby dropped her scrub brush. She wiped her wet hands on her apron. She hurried down the hall. She pushed open the swinging kitchen door. Clara was sitting up in the laundry basket. She was holding a wooden spoon Abby had given her. She banged it against the side of the basket. Thwack! 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 Hush, sweet girl. Abby rushed over. She scooped the baby up. Clara giggled. She wore tiny, mismatched woolen booties. Abby had knitted from scrap yarn. One blue, one gray. Then Abby heard the heavy thud of boots. Footsteps in the hallway. Coming toward the kitchen, it was Josiah. Panic seized her throat. It felt like a physical hand choking her. There was no back door close enough, no closet to duck into. If he caught her, he would ask questions. He would call the sheriff. Silas Montgomery would find out. He would come for the baby. He would kill Clara. The footsteps grew louder. Thump, thump, thump. Abby acted on pure terror. She dropped to her knees near the large oak flour barrel. She pulled Clara tight against her stomach. With one desperate motion, she lifted the heavy front hem of her hoop skirt. She pushed the baby under the wide, cage-like structure of the dress. She dropped the wool fabric back down, Just as the kitchen door swung open, Abby stayed on her knees. She grabbed a rag from her apron pocket and began frantically wiping the side of the flour barrel. Her heart was hammering so hard it hurt her ribs. Josiah walked in. He looked tired. He carried an empty coffee mug. "Morning, Mrs. Lawson," he said. His voice was deep, a low rumble. "Morning, Mr. Sterling," Abby choked out. She kept her head down. She rubbed the clean wood of the barrel until her knuckles ached underneath her skirt. In the dark, Clara moved. The baby grabbed Abby's ankle. Abby squeezed her eyes shut. "Please, please don't cry. Please." Josiah walked to the stove. He poured a coffee from the blue enamel pot. The rain beat against the window pane. The kitchen was quiet. Too quiet. "Cold day," Josiah remarked. "Yes, sir. Very cold," Abby said. Her voice shook under the skirt. Clara let out a soft, wet sneeze. Abby stopped breathing. Josiah paused. The coffee pot hovered over his mug. He turned his head slowly. He looked at Abby. She was kneeling on the floor, frozen solid. He took a step toward her, then another. He stopped about 3 feet away. Abby slowly opened her eyes. She looked down at the floorboards. There, sticking out from beneath the heavy hem of her dark wool skirt, was a tiny, gray woolen booty. Clara had kicked it off. The little gray booty sat there on the polished wood, a glaring, undeniable piece of evidence. The silence stretched. It pulled tight, like a wire about to snap. Abby closed her eyes again. This was it. It was over. The law would come. She braced herself for his anger, for the shouting, for the accusation of theft. Josiah looked at the booty. He looked at Abby's trembling shoulders. He looked at the wide, unnatural spread of her skirt. He didn't yell. He didn't run for the sheriff. He took a slow sip of his coffee. "Floors look good, Mrs. Lawson," he said quietly. Then he turned around. He walked out of the kitchen. The door swung shut behind him. Abby collapsed. She slumped against the barrel, pulling Clara out from under the heavy wool. She buried her face in the baby's neck and wept silent, shaking tears. She finished her shift in a state of dread. Every time a horse rode into the yard, she thought it was the law. But no one came. Josiah didn't speak to her for the rest of the day. That night, she carried Clara back to the freezing line shack. She didn't sleep. She just waited for the dawn. The next morning, Abby walked to the ranch alone. She left Clara in the shack. She had to face the fire. She had to know if she was fired, or worse, going to jail. She walked up the steps to the back porch. She stopped. There, right beside the kitchen door, was a wooden cradle. It wasn't an old, discarded thing. It was beautiful, carved from rich mahogany. The wood was polished smooth. Inside, it was lined with thick, clean sheepskin and a brand new wool blanket. Abby stared at it. Her hand went to her mouth. The kitchen door opened. Josiah stepped out. He wore his work coat. His hat was pulled low. Abby took a step back. She was shaking. "Mr. Sterling, I can explain. I swear to you I didn't steal her for money. I didn't do it for malice. Josiah held up a hand. He stopped her words. He looked at her. Really looked at her. His eyes were not angry. They were incredibly sad and incredibly kind. "I don't need you to explain, Mrs. Lawson," Josiah said. His voice was steady. "I know who that baby belongs to. Everyone in town knows the rumors about the Sullivan girl. I know what Silas Montgomery is capable of." Abby gasped. "Then you know he'll kill her, or claim her just to make her a slave. You know the law is on his side." Josiah stepped closer. He placed a large, calloused hand on the smooth wood of the cradle. "Listen to me very carefully, Abby," Josiah said. His voice deepened, carrying a weight that demanded absolute attention. "The law might call you a thief. The courts in this territory might say that a child is the property of the man who sired it. regardless of the violence he used. He looked directly into her frightened eyes. "But I am telling you this," Josiah stated clearly, emphasizing every word. "Hiding an innocent life under your dress to save it from death is not a crime. It is the act of a saint. The law is written by flawed men on pieces of paper, but human compassion is written on the soul. A child is a human being, not property to be claimed like cattle. Every person has a right to be safe, to be free, and to be loved." Tears spilled over Abby's lower lids. She couldn't stop them. "If the law says that baby belongs to a monster," Josiah continued, "then the law is broken. And we will not abide by it here. On this ranch, human rights and human dignity stand higher than any statute." He pushed the cradle gently toward her. "Bring her inside tomorrow, Mrs. Lawson," he said softly. "It's too cold in that shack for a little girl." Josiah tipped his hat. He walked past her, down the steps and out toward the barn. Abby stood on the porch. She rested her hands on the polished mahogany of the cradle. The wood was solid. It was real. For the first time in 10 years, she felt something strange. Something she thought had died inside her a long time ago. She felt safe. Winter settled hard over Sweetwater Ridge. The snow came down thick and heavy, burying the plains under a blanket of white. Inside the Sterling house, though, it was warm. For the first time in her life, Abby Lawson wasn't afraid of the cold. She wasn't afraid of the dark, either. The massive stone fireplace in the parlor stayed lit all day. The smell of burning pine and roasting beef filled the rooms. Clara was crawling now. She was fast. She pulled herself up on the legs of the heavy oak chairs. She babbled to the hunting dogs. And she had a laugh that echoed through the empty hallways, making the big house feel alive again. Josiah changed. The quiet, grim rancher softened. He started coming back to the house earlier. He didn't kick off his snowy boots, wash his hands, and sit on the rug with the baby. He carved her little wooden horses. He let her pull on his thick mustache. And in the evenings, after Clara went to sleep in her mahogany cradle, Josiah taught Abby. He didn't just want a housekeeper. He wanted her to know things. He brought down books from his library. Primers, poetry, history. They sat at the long dining table, an oil lamp burning between them. Abby traced the letters with a calloused finger. It was hard. Her mind felt stiff. 10 years of surviving didn't leave room for learning. But Josiah was patient. He never raised his voice. He just poured her more tea and waited. She started to read, slowly, then faster. It felt like unlocking a heavy iron door in her mind. Life was peaceful. It felt like a dream. Dreams out in the West rarely lasted. It happened on a Tuesday. The snow had stopped. The sky was a sharp, blinding blue. Abby was out on the wraparound porch. She was shaking out the heavy wool rugs. Clara was bundled up in a thick coat, sitting in a wooden crate, chewing on a biscuit. A group of riders came down the main trail. 4 men, black coats, good horses. Abby stopped shaking the rug. Her stomach tightened. She knew that front horse, a massive black stallion. It was Silas Montgomery. Josiah walked out of the barn. He wiped grease from his hands with a rag. He didn't look happy. Silas was a neighbor, technically. Their property lines touched at the river. They did business, cattle trades, water rights, but they were not friends. Silas pulled his horse up to the porch. He didn't dismount right away. He looked down at Josiah. Then his dark, flat eyes drifted to the porch. He looked at Abby. Then he looked at the baby. Abby froze. She couldn't breathe. She wanted to snatch Clara and run. But her boots felt nailed to the floorboards. Silas swung down from his saddle. He handed the reins to one of his men. He walked up the porch steps. His spurs jingled. A cold, metallic sound. "Sterling?" Silas said. His voice was smooth. Too smooth, like oiled leather. Heard you took in a stray. A housekeeper. Mrs. Lawson works for me, yes? Josiah said. He stepped up onto the porch. He put himself between Silas and Abby. Silas chuckled. He stepped around Josiah, moving closer to Abby. He stopped by the wooden crate. He looked down at Clara. Clara stopped chewing her biscuit. She looked up at the tall man in the dark coat. And a baby, Silas murmured. He tilted his head. Funny thing, my foreman told me a rumor said the crazy widow in town suddenly had a kid, said it showed up right around the time Margaret Sullivan S. girl died. Abby's heart slammed against her ribs. She gripped the heavy rug. Her hands were shaking. Silas reached out. He didn't touch the baby. He reached toward Abby. He grabbed her left hand, rough, fast. Abby gasped and tried to pull away, but his grip was like a vice. He stared at her fingers. On her index finger was a ring, woven out of dry grass. Cora had made it for her, a silly, childish thing. But Abby never took it off. Silas recognized it. He had seen Cora weaving them on the porch of the Sullivan house. His eyes flicked up to Abby's face. The realization hit him. It wasn't a shock. It was a dark, twisted kind of amusement. He leaned in close. He didn't care that Josiah was standing right there. He lowered his voice. Just for Abby. That's my property you're keeping, widow, Silas whispered. That's my blood. I don't care about the brat, but I do care about what belongs to me. You enjoy her while she's small. Soon as she's old enough to hold a scrub brush, I'm taking her back. I'll teach her to scrub the Montgomery floors for free. She'll be a good little slave. Abby felt the blood drain from her face. The yard spun. Before Silas could drop her hand, Josiah moved. He didn't yell. He didn't throw a punch. He stepped forward and shoved his arm hard against Silas' chest, driving the man back 2 full steps. Josiah placed himself firmly in front of Abby and the baby crate. His face was stone. His jaw was locked tight. Get your hands off her, Montgomery, Josiah said. The warning in his voice was absolute. Silas dusted off his coat. He smirked. Careful, Sterling. You're interfering with a man's family. The law says a man has rights to his own seed. Josiah didn't flinch. He stood tall. He looked Silas dead in the eye. He spoke loud enough for Silas's men to hear, loud enough for Abby to hear. You listen to me, Montgomery, Josiah declared, and you listen well. A human being is never property to be collected on a debt or forced into servitude. It doesn't matter what your twisted laws say. Human rights mean the right to live freely, regardless of whose biological seed put them on this earth. Silas' smirk vanished. His eyes narrowed. Every child, Josiah continued, his voice ringing across the cold yard, has a fundamental right to be protected from abusers. Biology does not give you a deed of ownership over a person. Not on my land, not while I draw breath. Silas stared at him for a long, quiet moment. He realized Josiah wasn't bluffing. Josiah would shoot him right here on the porch. Silas tipped his hat, a mocking gesture. We'll see what the judge has to say about your modern ideas. Sterling? Silas sneered. He turned, walked down the steps, and mounted his black horse. He spurred the animal hard and rode out, his men following close behind. Abby collapsed to her knees. She grabbed Clara from the crate and buried her face in the baby's thick coat, sobbing. Josiah knelt beside her. He wrapped his strong arms around both of them. He's going to take her, Abby cried. He's going to use the law to take her. No, Josiah said quietly. He won't. I gave you my word, and I don't break it. The rumors started like a slow leak in a dam. Then they broke wide open. Silas Montgomery didn't go to the sheriff right away. He was smarter than that. He went to the saloons. He went to the general store. He let his men talk. They said Abby Lawson was a thief. They said she stole a baby from a dying woman just to extort money from the father. They said she was a seductress, a woman of loose morals who had bewitched the respectable Josiah Sterling. The town of Sweetwater Ridge was bored and mean. They ate the rumors up. Abby felt it immediately. When she went into town for supplies, the store owner wouldn't look at her. He slammed her flour onto the counter. The women on the boardwalk crossed the muddy street to avoid walking past her. Even the preacher, a man who spoke of grace every Sunday, tipped his hat and quickly looked the other way. She was a ghost again. But this time, she wasn't invisible. She was hated. The isolation was heavy. It pressed down on her chest. She didn't care what they said about her. She had survived worse. But she cared what they said about Josiah. Josiah was a good man, a respected man. He sat on the town council. He funded the new schoolhouse roof. Now, his name was being dragged through the mud. Men were pulling out of cattle contracts with him. Silas was putting the squeeze on the whole county. It was a cold, bitter Tuesday night. A storm was blowing in from the mountains. The wind howled against the heavy timbers of the ranch house. Abby waited until Jaya was asleep. She crept into her small bedroom off the kitchen. She pulled out her worn canvas bag. She started packing. 2 dresses, a brush, Claris's woolen blankets, the few toys Josiah had made. She was leaving. It was the only way. If she took Clara and disappeared, Silas would lose his leverage. Josiah would get his reputation back. He wouldn't have to fight a losing battle in a corrupt courthouse. She wrapped Clara tightly in her coat. The baby slept, oblivious to the storm outside. Abby picked up the canvas bag. She blew out the oil lamp. She walked softly down the dark hallway. She reached the back door. She put her hand on the cold iron latch. "Where are you going?" Abby jumped. The bag slipped from her hand. It hit the floor with a soft thud. Josiah was standing in the doorway of the kitchen. He was wearing his trousers and a loose white shirt. He held a lit lantern in his hand. The yellow light cast long shadows across his face. He didn't look angry. He looked terrified. "I have to go, Joe," Abby whispered. Her throat felt tight. "I'm ruining you. Silas is destroying your business. The town is turning against you. I won't let you lose everything because of me." Josiah set the lantern down on the heavy oak table. He walked over to her. He took the canvas bag from the floor and tossed it into the corner. "You think I care about cattle contracts?" Josiah asked. His voice was low, shaking slightly. "You think I care what the gossips at the general store say about me?" "You should," Abby pleaded. Tears stung her eyes. "You built this place. You're a good man. You don't deserve this filth." "I don't deserve this empty house," Josiah fired back. "I lived in this quiet for 5 years, Abby. I was dead inside, just waking up and working until I couldn't think. Then you brought that baby in here. You brought life back into this place. You brought me back." Abby shook her head. "The law is coming, Joe. Silas will get an order. He'll have me arrested for theft. You'll be arrested for harboring me. I have to run." Josiah reached out. He took her free hand. His grip was warm, solid. "You aren't running anymore," Josiah said, "and Silas Montgomery isn't taking you or Clara anywhere." "How can you stop him?" Abby cried. "He's the baby's father. The law is on his side." "There is a way to stop him," Josiah said. His eyes were intense. "There is a way to give you legal standing, to give Clara a wall of protection that Silas can't break through." Abby stared at him. She didn't understand. Josiah took a deep breath. He let go of her hand. He reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small, simple gold band. He held it up in the lantern light. Abby's breath caught in her throat. She stepped back, instinctively pulling Clara tighter against her chest. "Joe, No, she whispered. You can't. You can't marry me out of pity. You can't marry me just to be a shield. 10 years of a hellish marriage flashed through her mind. The control, the ownership, the beatings. Marriage to Abby was a cage. It was a prison sentence. It's not pity, Abby, Josiah said softly. He didn't step closer. He gave her space. He knew her fears. It's the only way, Abby argued, her voice breaking. You're offering yourself as a sacrifice. You want to own my problems, just like my husband wanted to own me. Josiah's face hardened, not with anger, but with absolute conviction. Look at me, Abigail, he said. The use of her full name made her stop. Marriage is not an ownership contract where I become your master, Josiah declared, his voice cutting through the sound of the wind outside. I am not offering you a cage. I am proposing because we are equals. He held the ring out, his hand perfectly steady. You listen to me, Josiah continued, speaking the words clearly so they would settle deep in her frightened heart. Every woman has a fundamental right to stand beside a man as a partner, not as property. You have a right to be loved and respected. You, you are not a burden. You are not a scandal. You are the strongest woman I have ever known, and you do not deserve to suffer for a past that was never your fault. Abby stared at the gold band. Then she looked up into Josiah's eyes. There was no trick there, no hidden violence, no demand for submission. There was only honesty and a quiet, unshakable love. If you marry me, Josiah said, his voice dropping to a gentle rasp, Clara becomes my legal daughter. Silas Montgomery will have to fight my name, my money, and my lawyers. He will lose. I'll make sure he loses. But I want you to stay because you want to stay with me. The storm raged outside, battering the glass windows, but inside the kitchen, the air felt suddenly still. Abby looked at the baby sleeping against her chest. She looked at the canvas bag in the corner. Then she looked at the man offering her a real life, a life of equality. She reached out her hand. Her fingers were trembling. Josiah didn't grab her hand. He gently slid the gold band onto her finger. It fit perfectly. I'll stay, Abby whispered, the tears finally falling free. I'll stay, Joe. Josiah pulled her in. He wrapped his arms around her and the baby. He held them tight as the winter storm howled against the walls, powerless to touch them. The law in the West wasn't a straight line. It was a crooked fence. It was built by men with money, designed to keep what they considered theirs and keep everyone else out. It was a Tuesday morning when the crooked fence finally closed in on the Sterling ranch. The winter storm had passed. The sky was a pale washed-out blue. The snow was beginning to melt, turning the ranch yard into a soup of cold mud. Josiah and Abby were in the kitchen. The gold band on Abby's left hand caught the morning light. They hadn't gone to a church. They hadn't thrown a party. Josiah had ridden into town the morning after the storm, found a circuit judge, and signed the papers. It was quiet. It was legal. It was real. Clara was on the floor, banging a wooden block against the floorboards. Then the dogs started barking, not their usual bark at a coyote. This was a frantic, aggressive warning. Josiah set his coffee cup down. He walked to the window. He went perfectly still. Stay here, Josiah said. His voice was low, hard. Abby wiped her hands on her apron. She moved to the window. 5 men were riding into the yard. They wore heavy canvas dusters and flat-brimmed hats. At the front was Sheriff Miller. A silver star was pinned to his chest. He didn't look happy. He looked like a man about to do a job he hated. Behind the deputies, riding his massive black stallion, was Silas Montgomery. He was smiling. Abby asked, breath hitched. She scooped Clara up from the floor and held the baby tight. The old panic, the deep, bone-chilling fear of her past, rushed back in. Josiah strapped on his gun belt. He didn't check the cylinder. He knew it was loaded. He opened the front door and stepped out onto the porch. "Morning, Miller," Josiah called out. His voice carried across the cold, muddy yard. Sheriff Miller pulled back on his reins. His horse stamped its hooves. "Morning, Joe. Wish I was here for coffee. But I'm not. I can see that," Josiah said. His eyes flicked to Silas. "What's he doing on my land?" Silas chuckled. He tipped his hat. "Just here to collect my property, Sterling. Law says a man has a right to be present." Sheriff Miller sighed. He reached into his duster. He pulled out a folded piece of heavy paper. It had a red wax seal on the bottom. "I have a warrant, Joe," Miller said. His voice was tired. "Signed by Judge Harrison himself. Sworn affidavit from Mr. Montgomery." Josiah didn't move. He stood at the top of the stairs like a stone wall. "A warrant for what?" "Grand larceny." "Kidnapping," Miller read from the paper. "It's for Abigail Lawson. It states she unlawfully stole Bloodkin from the Sullivan home and has been hiding the child." The door behind Josiah creaked open. Abby stepped out. She held Clara tight against her chest. The wind whipped her hair across her face. Silas' eyes lit up. He pointed a thick gloved finger at the baby. "There she is," Silas said. "That's the stolen property. Go on, Sheriff. Do your job. Arrest the thief and hand me my kin." Josiah stepped back, covering Abby. He rested his right hand on the butt of his revolver. "Abigail Lawson doesn't exist anymore," Josiah said. His voice was like grinding iron. "This is Abby Darling. She is my wife, and that child is legally under my protection." Sheriff Miller shook his head. He looked genuinely sick. "It doesn't matter," Joe Miller said softly. "The warrant predates the wedding. Montgomery claims the child was stolen before any vows were said. The law in this territory says a child belongs to the father. It says a man's seed is his property. I have to take her in. Both of them." Josiah drew his gun. It was a smooth, practiced motion. The hammer clicked back. The sound was loud in the quiet yard. 4 deputies immediately drew their rifles and aimed them at the porch. "Nobody is taking my wife," Josiah said, "and nobody is handing that baby over to a murderer." "Joe, put it down," Miller pleaded. "You shoot me, you hang, and Montgomery takes the kid anyway. You know I'm right. Don't make her a widow again." Abby felt the world spinning. Jaya was going to die, right here on the porch. Because of her. She reached out. She put her hand over Josiah's, a gun hand. Josiah looked back at her. His eyes were wild, desperate. "No," Abby whispered. She was crying, but her voice was steady. "No more blood, Joe. They'll kill you. Put it away. I'll go with him." "Abby, I can't let him take you," Josiah choked out. "You promised to fight him," Abby said. "Fight him where he can't shoot you. Fight him in the courthouse. Bring your lawyers. Bring the truth." "I trust you, Joe. I trust you." Josiah stared at her. He saw the iron in her spine. The woman who had hidden a baby under her skirt was not a coward. She was a survivor. Slowly, agonizingly, Josiah lowered the hammer. He slid the gun back into its holster. "I'm riding right behind you, Miller," Josiah warned. "If he lays one hand on her, badge or no badge, I'll put a bullet in his eye." "He won't touch her," Miller promised. "She'll be safe in my jail." Abby walked down the steps. The mud sucked at her boots. She didn't look at Silas. She kept her eyes on the sheriff. She climbed into the back of the Deputy S-Wagon, holding Clara tight against the cold. Sweetwater Ridge Courthouse was a large, square building made of rough-hewn pine. It usually smelled of old tobacco and floor wax. Today, it smelled of sweat and wet wool. The courtroom was packed, standing room only. The whole town had turned out to see the wealthy rancher and his scandalous new wife. The wood stove in the corner was burning hot, making the air thick and stifling. Abby sat at the defendant's table. She held Clara in her lap. The baby was fussy, feeling the tension in the room. Josiah sat right beside them. He wore his dark suit. His face was unreadable. Across the aisle sat Montgomery. He looked relaxed. He was smoking a thin cigar, completely ignoring the no smoking sign nailed to the wall. He had a slick-looking lawyer from Cheyenne sitting next to him. The heavy wooden door behind the bench opened. "All rise," the bailiff shouted. Judge Harrison walked in. He was a man in his late 60s, silver hair, a face lined with years of hard decisions. He didn't look like a man who enjoyed his job. He looked tired. He sit down. He slammed his wooden gavel. It sounded like a gunshot. The room went dead silent. "Take your seats," Judge Harrison grumbled. He adjusted his spectacles. He looked down at the paperwork. "We are here for the matter of Montgomery versus Sterling. Charges are grand larceny and unlawful retention of paternal property. Mr. Montgomery, your counsel may proceed." Silas's lawyer stood up. He smoothed his expensive vest. "Your Honor," the lawyer began, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "This is a simple case, a tragic one, but simple. My client, Mr. Montgomery, fathered a child with the late Cora Sullivan. Upon her tragic passing, this woman," he pointed a long finger at Abby, "stole the infant in the night. She took the child to extort money from my client. Now she hides behind a hasty marriage to a wealthy man." The crowd murmured. "The law of this territory is clear, Your Honor," the lawyer continued, raising his voice. "A child is the legal property of the biological father. A man has an absolute right to his own seed, his own blood. We ask that the stolen property, the infant, be returned to her rightful owner immediately, and we ask that the thief be punished." The lawyer sat down. Silas smirked. Abby felt sick. They weren't talking about a human being. They were talking about a calf, a piece of furniture. Judge Harrison looked over at Josiah. "Mr. Sterling, you have counsel?" Josiah stood up. He didn't have a lawyer. He didn't want one. "I speak for my wife, Your Honor," Josiah said. His voice was calm. It carried easily to the back row. "Proceed," the judge said. Josiah stepped out from behind the table. He walked to the center of the courtroom. He looked at the townspeople. He looked at Silas. Finally, he looked up at Judge Harrison. "Your Honor," Josiah started, "counsel is right about one thing. This is a tragic case, but he is lying about the rest." "Objection," Silas' lawyer shouted. "Overruled," the judge snapped. "Let the man speak." "Abigail didn't steal a child," Josiah said. "She was handed that child by a dying mother. Cora Sullivan begged my wife to take the baby. She begged her to run because she knew Silas Montgomery intended to kill the child to hide his sins. And when he couldn't kill her, he decided he would claim her, just to turn his own flesh and blood into an unpaid servant." Silas jumped up. "That's a damn lie. Quiet in my court." Judge Harrison roared, slamming the gavel. "Sit down, Mr. Montgomery, or I will hold you in contempt." Silas sat, glaring. Josiah didn't lose his rhythm. He stepped closer to the bench. His eyes were burning with a fierce, absolute light. "They speak of the law, Your Honor," Josiah said. His voice grew louder, filling every corner of the hot, crowded room. "They speak of property. They stand in this court of justice and tell you that a man owns a child simply because he forced himself upon a young woman. They tell you that blood dictates ownership." Josiah turned slightly, pointing toward Abby. She sat trembling, clutching the innocent, wide-eyed baby. "Look at that child," Josiah demanded. "Look at the woman holding her." Abigail starved herself so that baby could eat. She froze in a line shack so that baby could stay warm. She risked her freedom to keep an innocent life safe from a monster. Josiah turned back to the judge. He stood tall. He was no longer just a rancher. He was a man demanding a reckoning. "Your Honor," Josiah declared, his voice ringing with power and clarity. "If our laws allow a tyrant to rip a child from the only mother who has ever shown it love, simply because he shares its blood, then the law itself is a crime." The courtroom was completely still. People stopped breathing. Josiah didn't stop. He pressed forward, delivering the absolute truth. "We cannot speak of American justice if women and children do not have equal rights and protection before the court," Josiah thundered. "A human being is not property. Fatherhood is a privilege earned through love, care, and sacrifice. It is not a biological entitlement to ownership. If you give that child to that man, you are not upholding the law. You are sentencing a human being to slavery." Josiah stood there for a long moment. The silence in the room was deafening. He had spoken the words no one out. West dared to say out loud. He had challenged the very foundation of the old patriarchal rules. He walked back to the table and sat down next to Abby. He reached out and took her shaking hand. His grip was warm and steady. Silas' lawyer jumped up, his face red. "Your Honor, this is theatrical nonsense. The law is the law. Property rights are absolute in this territory. Emotion does not override the statutes of Wyoming." Judge Harrison sat motionless. He looked at the heavy, leather-bound law book sitting on his desk. Then he looked at Silas Montgomery. Finally, he looked at Abby and the baby. The judge took off his spectacles. He rubbed his tired eyes. He picked up his gavel. "The law," Judge Harrison said slowly, his voice rough, "indeed written on paper. And as a judge, I am sworn to uphold it." Abby's heart dropped into her stomach. She squeezed her eyes shut. It was over. Josiah's beautiful words hadn't been enough. The crooked fence was going to hold. "However," Judge Harrison continued. The tone of his voice shifted. It grew heavier. "The law was also written by imperfect men. And occasionally, a case presents itself that forces a court to look beyond the ink and look into the soul of the matter." Silas leaned forward, a scowl forming on his face. "Mister, Sterling makes a compelling argument regarding the welfare of the child and the moral failings of property statutes when applied to human lives," the judge said. "But morality requires proof. Mr. Sterling claims Mr. Montgomery intended harm. Mr. Montgomery claims paternal right. It is one man's word against another's." Judge Harrison banged his gavel once. "It is late in the day," the judge announced. "I need time to review the statutes and weigh the testimonies given here. This court is adjourned until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. At that time, I will render my final decision." The bailiff stepped forward. "Court is adjourned." The crowd immediately erupted into loud whispers and arguments. Sheriff Miller walked over to the defense table. He looked apologetic. "I'm sorry, Joe, but I have to take her back to the cell for the night. Remand stands until the judge rules." Josiah stood up. He nodded. He understood. He knelt down beside Abby's chair. "One more night, Abby," Josiah whispered, kissing her forehead. "Just one more night in the dark. I swear it." Abby stood up. She held Clara close. She looked across the room. Silas Montgomery was staring right at her. He tapped his cigar against the wooden railing, a cruel, victorious smile playing on his lips. He believed the law would serve him. He believed he had already won. Abby turned her back on him. She followed the sheriff out of the courtroom, holding her head high. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She was a mother. And tomorrow, the whole world would know it. The town jail smelled like rusted iron and stale coffee. Abby sat on the edge of the narrow cot. The mattress was thin. The blanket was rough wool. Clara was asleep against her chest, her tiny breaths warm against Abby's neck. Outside, the sun was just starting to break over the mountains. It painted the small barred window in shades of pale gray. Footsteps echoed in the hallway, heavy, familiar. Josiah stopped in front of the cell. He held a tin cup of steaming coffee. He looked like he hadn't slept a single minute. His eyes were red-rimmed. His jaw was set tight. Sheriff Miller unlocked the iron door. It groaned on its hinges. "Morning, Abby," Josiah said softly. He stepped in and handed her the cup. "Morning," she whispered. She took a sip. It was hot and bitter. It grounded her. "You holding up?" he asked. He reached out and touched Clara's soft hair. "I'm scared, Joe," Abby admitted. She didn't hide it anymore. Hiding took too much energy. The judge sounded like he was going to side with the law. With Silas. Josiah knelt in front of her. He took her free hand. His grip was an anchor in a storm. "I won't let him take her," Josiah said, "even if I have to put you both on a fast train to California today. We fight the law, or we outrun it, but we don't surrender." Abby looked into his eyes. She saw the absolute truth there. He meant it. He would give up his ranch, his name, his whole life, just to keep them safe. "Time to go, folks," Sheriff Miller said from the doorway. He sounded apologetic. "Judge is waiting." Abby stood up. She smoothed Clara's dress. She lifted her chin. They walked back to the courthouse. The air was sharp and cold. The mud in the street was frozen solid again. The townspeople were already lining the boardwalks. They stared as Abby walked by. But it was different today. There were no sneers, no whispers of thief. After Josiah Hack's speech yesterday, the town was divided. Some looked at Abby with pity. A few women looked at her with quiet respect. The courtroom was even more crowded than the day before. The air was thick. You could hardly breathe. Abby took her seat at the defense table. Josiah sat right beside her. Across the aisle, Silas Montgomery looked like a man who had already won. He was wearing a brand new silver vest. He leaned back in his chair, smiling at his lawyer. He didn't even look at Clara. "All rise," the bailiff called out. Judge Harrison walked to the bench. He moved slowly. He looked older today. He carried a stack of heavy law books and set them down with a thud. He took his seat. He picked up his gavel and tapped it once. "Court is in session," Judge Harrison announced. His voice was gravelly. "I have spent the night reviewing the territorial statutes regarding paternal rights and property." Silas sat up a little straighter. His smile widened. "The law," the judge continued, "is rigid. It states clearly that a biological father retains the right to claim his offspring. Without a mother present to contest, and without proof of unfitness, the court's hands are traditionally tied." Abby felt the air leave her lungs. She gripped the edge of the wooden table. Beside her, Josiah's hand moved toward his gun belt. However, Judge Harrison raised a hand, stopping the murmur in the crowd. "This court requires absolute certainty before removing a child from a safe home. Mr. Sterling made grave accusations yesterday. Accusations of violence, of murderous intent by Mr. Montgomery." Silas' lawyer jumped up. "Your Honor, accusations without a shred of proof. It is hearsay." "Sit down, counselor," Judge Harrison snapped. "I am aware it is hearsay, which is why I am struggling to find a legal avenue to deny your client's petition, despite my own deep misgivings." Silas grinned. He looked over at Josiah. It was a look of pure, venomous triumph. The judge picked up his pen. He dipped it in the inkwell. He was preparing to sign the order. Then, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Every head in the room turned. A woman stood in the doorway. She was dressed entirely in black mourning clothes. She leaned heavily on a silver-tipped walking cane. Her face was pale, lined with grief and sleepless nights. It was Margaret Sullivan. The courtroom erupted into whispers. Silas Montgomery's smile vanished. He gripped the arms of his chair. Margaret walked down the center aisle. She didn't look right or left. She didn't look at Silas. She kept her eyes fixed on the judge. Every step was a physical effort. She reached the wooden gate that separated the gallery from the court. "Your Honor," Margaret said. Her voice was thin, but it carried in the dead, silent room. "I have testimony to give, if the court will hear it." Judge Harrison put his pen down. He looked at her over his spectacles. "Mrs. Sullivan, you understand the nature of these proceedings?" "I do," Margaret said. She looked over at Abby. Her eyes softened, just for a second. "I understand what is at stake. I should have come yesterday. I should have spoken months ago. But I was a coward." "Objection," Silas' lawyer shouted, panic creeping into his voice. "This witness was not called. This is highly irregular." "Overruled," Judge Harrison barked. "I want to hear the truth. Take the stand, Mrs. Sullivan." Margaret walked to the witness box. She placed her hand on the Bible. She swore the oath. She sat down, resting both hands on her cane. "Speak, Mrs. Sullivan," the judge prompted. Margaret took a shaky breath. She looked out at the packed room. She was looking at her neighbors, her friends, the people she had spent her life trying to impress. She was about to burn her own house down. "My daughter, Cora, did not die of consumption," Margaret said. The words hit the room like a physical blow. "She died giving birth to that little girl." Margaret pointed a trembling finger at Clara. The crowd gasped. "And she died," Margaret continued, her voice gaining strength, "because she was broken. She was assaulted in my own home by that man." She turned and pointed her cane directly at Silas Montgomery. "He forced himself upon her. He ruined her," Margaret stated, her voice shaking with rage and sorrow. "And when the child was born, he sent word to me. He told me to dispose of it, to drown it in the creek, to throw it to the wolves. He said he didn't want the evidence walking around." Silas leaped to his feet. His chair crept backward onto the floor. "She's lying. The old hag is out of her mind with grief. Sit down and shut your mouth, Montgomery," Judge Harrison roared, slamming his gavel repeatedly. "Bailiff, if he speaks again, gag him." Silas stood there, his face purple with rage. He slowly picked up his chair and sat down. Margaret looked at Abby. Tears finally spilled down the older woman's cheeks. "I was going to do it," Margaret confessed, her voice breaking. "God forgive me. I was going to let his men take the baby. I wanted to protect my reputation. But Abby Lawson took the child. She ran into a blizzard with nothing but an apron to wrap the baby in. She didn't steal her. She saved her." Margaret turned back to the judge. "That child," Margaret said, pointing to Clara, "is a human being. She is not a stain to be washed away to protect a man's pride. Silas Montgomery doesn't want her to love her. He wants her to punish Abby. He wants her to prove he can own anything in this county. Do not give my granddaughter to a monster." Margaret lowered her head. She wept softly into her black lace handkerchief. The courtroom was completely silent. You could hear the wood crackle in the stove. Abby felt a tear slip down her cheek. She pulled Clara tighter. Josiah wrapped his arm around Abby's shoulders. Silas slowly stood up. He looked pale. "Your Honor, even if these scandalous allegations are true, the law still dictates that the biological father..." "Counselor," Judge Harrison interrupted. His voice was dangerously low. "If you finish that sentence, I will have you disbarred in this territory." The lawyer immediately sat down. Judge Harrison looked out over the courtroom. He looked at Silas Montgomery, who was glaring at the bench with pure hatred. He looked at Margaret Sullivan, broken by the truth. Then He looked at Josiah and Abby. The judge sat up straight. He picked up his gavel, but he didn't hit the block yet. He wanted everyone in the room to hear him. The purpose of the law is to serve justice, Judge Harrison declared, his voice booming with authority. When the law is used as a weapon by the wicked to harm the innocent, it is no longer justice. It is tyranny. The judge turned his stern gaze directly to the gallery. "Listen to me, all of you," Judge Harrison commanded. "Civil rights must be rooted in basic morality. A society that views women and children as mere property, subject to the violent whims of men, is a society that has lost its soul." He turned back to Silas. "This court terminates Silas Montgomery's paternal claims, effectively immediately," the judge stated. The words rang like bells. Silas slammed his fists on the table. Judge Harrison ignored him. He looked directly at Abby and Josiah. He leaned forward, speaking the absolute truth of the matter so the entire territory would understand. "Fatherhood," the judge said, his words clear and unwavering, "is a privilege earned through love, protection, and care. It is not a biological entitlement to ownership. Men do not own their children. Men do not own women. Every person in this territory has a fundamental right to be treated with dignity and equality." He picked up his pen. He violently scratched a line through Silas' petition. "The charges against Abigail Sterling are dismissed," Judge Harrison ruled. "I hereby grant full, permanent guardianship of the child, Clara, to Josiah and Abigail Sterling. They have proven themselves to be the true parents." Bang! The gavel fell. The courtroom exploded. People stood up. Some cheered. Some just stared in shock. Silas Montgomery kicked his table. He pointed a finger at Josiah. "This isn't over, Sterling. You hear me? You're a dead man." Sheriff Miller and two deputies instantly stepped up to Silas, grabbing him by the arms. "You need to leave, Silas, now." Silas wrenched his arms free. He shoved past the deputies, shoved past his own lawyer, and stormed out the back doors of the courtroom. Abby couldn't breathe. She just sat there. The heavy weight that had crushed her chest for 10 years was suddenly gone. It was just gone. Josiah pulled her up. He wrapped his arms around her and the baby. He buried his face in her hair. "It's over," Josiah whispered. "We won. She's ours." Margaret Sullivan walked slowly past their table. She looked exhausted, empty. Abby reached out. She touched the older woman's arm. "Thank you," Abby said softly. "You gave up everything to save us today." Margaret looked at the baby. A small, sad smile touched her lips. "I didn't lose everything, Abby. I saved the only good piece of Cora left in this world. Take care of her." Margaret turned and walked out of the courtroom, her cane clicking softly on the wooden floor. Abby and Josiah walked out of the courthouse together. The sheriff held the door open for them. He tipped his hat. They stepped out onto the boardwalk. The cold morning air had warmed. The sun was high and bright, melting the snow on the rooftops. The water dripped down in a steady, peaceful rhythm. Josiah looked down at Abby. The gold band on her finger caught the sunlight. "Let's go home, Mrs. Sterling," he said. Abby looked up at him. She looked down at Clara, who was wide awake, looking at the bright blue Wyoming sky. She wasn't a widow anymore. She wasn't an outcast. She wasn't a thief. She was a mother. She was a wife. She was a free woman. "Yes," Abby smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in a decade. "Let's go home." Spring arrived in Sweetwater Ridge with a sudden, violent thaw. The snowmelt flooded the creeks. The mud was thick enough to pull a boot right off a man's foot. But then, almost overnight, the green burst through. The valley floor turned into an ocean of tall, sweet grass. For the first time in her life, Abby Sterling wasn't dreading the future. The courthouse felt like a lifetime ago. Silas Montgomery had gone quiet. He hadn't been seen in town for weeks. Folks said he was licking his wounds. Life on the ranch was a good, steady rhythm. Clara was walking now. Clumsy, heavy steps that usually ended with a soft tumble onto the parlor rug. She laughed all the time, a loud, bright sound that chased the shadows out of the corners of the big house. Abby was happy. Truly, deeply happy. But Josiah was fading. It didn't happen all at once. It was a slow retreat. He started staying out in the pastures later, coming home long after the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks. When he was home, he was quiet. He would sit in his leather chair by the fire, a book open on his lap, but he never turned the pages. He was looking through the fire, not at it. At first, Abby thought it was the ranch. Spring meant branding. It meant moving the herds. It was hard, exhausting work. But it wasn't the work. A woman who had survived 10 years of a brutal marriage knew how to read a man. She knew the difference between a tired body and a haunted Joe was haunted. It was a late Tuesday evening. The house was quiet. Clara was asleep upstairs in her mahogany cradle. The wind was soft, blowing through the open windows, smelling of wet pine and damp earth. Josiah was out on the wrap-around porch. He was sitting in the wooden rocking chair. He wasn't rocking. He was just staring out into the dark. He had a glass of amber whiskey in his hand. He hadn't taken a sip. Abby walked out the screen door. It slapped shut behind her. Josiah didn't flinch. He didn't even turn his head. Abby walked over. She leaned against the porch rail, facing him. The moonlight caught the silver in his dark hair. His shoulders were slumped. The strong, unshakable man who had stared down a corrupt judge looked like he was carrying a mountain on his back. "You're miles away, Joe," Abby said softly. "Further than that," Josiah muttered. His voice was rough, like dry gravel. "The cattle?" Abby asked, though she already knew the answer. "Cattle are fine. Grass is good this year." Abby crossed her arms against the evening chill. "Then what is it? Silas?" Josiah shook his head. He finally took a sip of the whiskey. He swallowed hard. "Silas is a snake, but he's a snake I can see. I know how to fight a snake." He set the glass down on the porch floorboards. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He dropped his face into his calloused hands. It broke Abby's heart. She walked over and knelt beside his chair. She put a hand on his knee. "Talk to me, Joe," she whispered. "When I was hiding in the dark, terrified of the whole world, you didn't let me stay there. You pulled me into the light now. You're hiding. Let me help you." Josiah took a long, shaking breath. He slowly lifted his head. His dark eyes were filled with a shame, so deep it made Abby catch her breath. "I'm a fraud, Abby," Josiah said. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. "That day in court, I stood up there in front of the whole town. I looked the judge in the eye. I talked about fatherhood, about love, about what makes a real man. And you meant every word," Abby said firmly. "You saved Clara. You saved me." "I did," Josiah nodded. "But I didn't have the right to say those words, because I'm no better than Silas." Abby frowned. She squeezed his knee. "Don't say that. Don't ever say that. You are nothing like him." "Aren't I?" Josiah laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. "Silas wanted to throw his child away to save his reputation. I did the exact same thing." The night went dead silent. The wind seemed to stop. Abby stared at him. She didn't pull her hand away. "What are you talking about, Joe?" Josiah looked out at the dark horizon. He was looking east, toward the cities, toward a life he had left behind. "I wasn't always a rancher," Josiah started. His voice was low, monotone, like he was reading a death sentence. "I grew up in Boston. My father was a banker, wealthy, cruel. He mapped out my whole life before I could walk. Who I would marry, what bank I would run. He rubbed a hand over his face. I was 20, Josiah continued, and I fell in love. Her name was Ruth. She was a maid in my father's house. She was smart. She was kind. She was everything those high society girls weren't. Abby listened. She didn't interrupt. We weren't careful, Josiah said. She got with child. I was terrified. But I loved her. I went to my father. I told him I was going to marry her. Josiah stopped. He squeezed his eyes shut. The memory was a physical pain. He didn't yell, Josiah whispered. He just opened his ledger. He told me if I married her, I was cut off. Not a penny. He told me he would make sure no bank, no businesses in Boston would ever hire me. He said we would starve in the gutter. But if I left her, he would buy me this ranch out west. He would make me a king. Abby felt a cold knot form in her stomach. She knew what was coming. I was 20 years old, Josiah choked out. I was a coward. I looked at the street, and I looked at the money. I chose the money. Tears, hot and fast, slid down the rancheress' weathered cheeks. I left her, Abby. I packed my bags in the dead of night and took the train west. I didn't even say goodbye. I just ran. Abby took a deep breath. And the baby? A boy, Josiah said. He opened his eyes. They were completely hollow. His name's Thomas. He's 16 years old. I know, because my father's lawyer sends me a letter once a year. I send money every month, anonymously. Ruth doesn't know it's from me, but money doesn't make a father. He looked at Abby. He was waiting for the disgust. He was waiting for her to pull her hand away, to look at him the way the town used to look at her. I abandoned my own blood, Josiah said, because I was scared, because I was weak. When I looked at Silas in that courtroom, I didn't just see a monster. I saw myself, just a different version. I have a son I've never met. I'm a hypocrite, Abby. I don't deserve you, and I don't deserve Clara. Josiah braced himself, but Abby didn't pull away. She moved closer. She reached up with both hands. She grabbed his face. Her fingers were strong. She forced him to look directly into her eyes. There was no pity in her gaze, and there was absolutely no disgust. There was only a fierce, burning clarity. Josiah Sterling, you listen to me, Abby commanded. Her voice was sharp, cutting right through his self-pity. He blinked, stunned by her strength. You think you're the only person in this world who has made a mistake? Abby asked. You think I don't have regrets? I stayed with a man who beat me for 10 years because I was too terrified to walk out the door. Fear makes cowards of us all, Joe. Fear makes us do terrible things. She leaned in closer. She wasn't whispering now. She was teaching. She was laying down a truth that she had learned the hardest way possible. But you are not that 20-year-old boy anymore, Abby said, her words striking like a hammer on an anvil. We are all broken in some way, Joe. We all have scars. But true healing, it doesn't mean pretending the past didn't happen. It doesn't mean hiding in the dark and punishing yourself. She let her thumbs gently wipe the tears from his cheeks. Healing is having the courage to face your mistakes, Abby declared, stating the words so clearly they echoed on the porch. Healing is taking the broken pieces of your past and using love to make it right. You cannot undo what you did, but you can choose what you do tomorrow. Josiah stared at her. He hates me. He has to. I'm a stranger who left his mother to starve. Then you face his anger, Abby said simply. You take it, because you owe it to him. Fatherhood isn't just about claiming a child. It's about showing up, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Abby let go of his face. She stood up. She smoothed the front of her apron. I didn't marry a coward, Abby said. I married a man who bought a cradle for a stolen baby. I married a man who stood down a judge for a woman the whole town hated. Josiah slowly stood up. He felt unsteady, like a man waking up from a long, terrible fever. "What are you saying, Abby?" he asked. "I'm saying we are packing our bags," Abby told him. Her voice was all business now. "I'll talk to the foreman tomorrow morning. He can manage the herds for a month. We're taking Clara. We're getting on the Union Pacific." Josiah's mouth fell open. "The train? To where?" "To Boston, Joe," Abby said. She offered him a small, determined smile. "We're going to Boston. You're going to look that woman in the eye and apologize. And then we are going to bring our son home." Josiah couldn't speak. His chest heaved. The mountain he had been carrying for 16 years suddenly cracked wide open. He stepped forward. He wrapped his arms around Abby. He pulled her flush against him and buried his face in her shoulder. He wept, not tears of shame this time, but tears of profound, overwhelming relief. "Thank you," Josiah whispered against her hair. "God, Abby, thank you." Abby wrapped her arms around his broad back. She held him tight. "You told me once that human rights mean the right to live freely," Abby murmured into his ear. "That includes you, Joe. You have the right to be free from your own guilt. But you have to earn it." They stood there on the porch for a long time. The wind blew through the valley, rustling the sweet grass. The stars were bright and hard in the black Wyoming sky. The ghost of the past was finally out in the open. It was terrifying. It was ugly, but it was real. And as Abby held her husband, she knew they were ready to face it. They weren't just running a ranch anymore. They were building a family. And a real family didn't leave anyone behind in the dark. The Union Pacific train rattled, iron on iron. It sounded like a heavy heartbeat against the tracks. Josiah stared out the thick glass window. The open plains of Wyoming were gone. The green fields of the Midwest had blurred by. Now there were just trees, buildings, smoke. They were getting closer to Boston. And Josiah was getting quieter. Abby sat across from him. She held Clara on her lap. The baby was fascinated by the moving world outside. She patted the glass with sticky hands. Abby reached across the small table. She put her hand over Josiah S. His knuckles were white. "Breathe, Joe," Abby said softly. Josiah pulled his gaze away from the window. He looked at her. He tried to smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "What if he won't look at me?" Josiah asked. His voice was barely a whisper. "What if I walk up to that door and he shuts it in my face? I'd deserve it." "Maybe he will," Abby said. She didn't sugarcoat it. That wasn't her way. "He has a right to be angry. You owe him a debt, and debts take time to pay." She squeezed his hand. "But you are showing up," she told him. "That's the first step. You can't fix a broken fence until you walk out to the pasture and look at it." Josiah nodded. He took a deep breath. He held onto her hand like it was a lifeline. Boston was loud. It was cramped. The air tasted like coal and salt. They walked off the train platform. The cobblestone streets felt strange under Abby's boots. She was used to dust and mud. Here, everything was brick and stone and noise. Carriages rattled past. People rushed by, heads down, avoiding each other's eyes. Josiah knew the way. He hadn't been here in 16 years, but his feet remembered. They walked to the working-class district. The houses here were narrow, squeezed tight together. Paint was peeling from the window frames. Laundry hung on lines strung between alleyways. Josiah stopped in front of a blue door. The paint was chipping. He took off his hat. His hands were shaking. Abby stepped up beside him. She held Clara on her hip. She gave him a single firm nod. Josiah knocked 3 sharp raps. A minute passed. It felt like an hour. Then the lock clicked. The door pulled open. A woman stood there. She was in her late 30s. Her hair was pulled back in a tight, sensible bun. She wore a faded gray dress protected by a white apron. Her hands were wet with dishwater. She looked at Josiah. 16 years was a long time, but some faces you never forget. The color drained from Ruth's face. She grabbed the edge of the doorframe. "Josiah," she breathed. It wasn't a greeting. It was a shock. "Hello, Ruth," Josiah said. His voice broke. I'm sorry to come unannounced." Ruth looked past at him. She saw Abby. She saw the baby. Her eyes narrowed. Defenses went up. A mother protecting her home. "What do you want?" Ruth asked. Her voice grew hard, cold. "I came to apologize," Josiah said. He didn't make excuses. He didn't soften it. "I came to look you in the eye and tell you I was a coward, and I came to see my son. If you'll let me." Ruth stared at him. She looked for the lie. She looked for the arrogant young rich boy who had abandoned her. She didn't find him. She found a weathered, broken man holding his hat in his hands. Before she could answer, a voice called out from inside the house. "Ma? Who's at the door?" Footsteps sounded on the wooden floorboards. A boy stepped up behind Ruth. He was tall, lanky, 16 years old. He had dark hair, broad shoulders, and eyes that were the exact same shade of brown as Josiah S. It was like looking into a ghost of the past. Thomas stopped. He looked at Josiah. He didn't know the face, but he felt the weight of the moment. He looked at his mother. "Who is this, Ma?" Thomas asked. Ruth took a deep breath. She didn't lie. She had never lied to him. "Thomas," Ruth said softly, "this is Josiah Sterling." The boy went perfectly still. His jaw tightened. The anger hit him fast. 16 years of questions. 16 years of watching his mother scrape by. "You," Thomas said. The word was venomous. "Thomas?" Jediah started. "Get out, Thomas." He stepped in front of his mother. He puffed at chest. "We don't need your money. We don't need you. Go back to wherever you came from." Josiah didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He just nodded slowly. "You have every right to hate me," Josiah said. "I left you. I chose an easy life over the right one. It was the biggest mistake of my life." "A mistake?" Thomas laughed, a bitter, sharp sound. "A mistake is dropping a glass. You abandoned us." Abby stepped forward, just half a pace. "He did," Abby said gently. Thomas looked at her. He looked at the baby. He was confused by her calm tone. "He made a terrible choice," Abby continued, meeting the boy's angry gaze. "But he is here now. It took him 16 years to find his courage. I know a thing or two about being scared. It makes you run." "But he stopped running, Thomas. He came to face you. That's worth at least a conversation." Thomas looked at Abby. Then he looked at Josiah. Ruth sighed. The anger was draining out of her, replaced by a deep exhaustion. "Come in, Joe. People are staring." They stepped into the small, cramped parlor. It was a difficult afternoon. There was shouting. There were tears. Thomas didn't forgive Josiah. Not easily, he demanded answers. He demanded the ugly truth. And Josiah gave it to him, every painful detail. By evening, the fire was burnt low. They sat around a small wooden table. "I'm building a school in Wyoming," Josiah told Thomas, "for kids out on the frontier. I could use a smart young man to help me run it, help me teach. The offer is there whenever you want it. And Ruth, the door is open for you too." Thomas looked at his empty teacup. "I don't know." "You don't have to know today," Josiah said. "Take your time." They left the house an hour later. The sun had set. The Boston streets were dark, lit only by flickering gas lamps. A thick fog was rolling in from the harbor. Josiah felt lighter. The mountain was off his back. He had taken the first step. They walked down a narrow cobblestone alleyway toward their hotel. The brick walls on either side were slick with dampness. "He's a good boy," Abby said, holding Clara tight. "He has your eyes. He has his mother's fire," Josiah smiled. Well, ain't this a touching family reunion?" The voice echoed in the alley. Josiah stopped dead. He pushed Abby behind him. A figure stepped out from the fog, blocking the end of the alley. It was Silas Montgomery. He didn't look like a wealthy rancher anymore. His coat was dirty. He smelled of cheap whiskey and sweat. He held a heavy revolver in his right hand. The hammer was already cocked. "Silas," Josiah said. His voice was calm, but his hand moved slowly toward his own gun. "Don't do it, Sterling," Silas warned, raising his gun. "I'll shoot the woman first, then the brat, then you." Abby felt her heart hammer against her ribs. She pressed herself against the cold brick wall, shielding Clara. "What are you doing here, Silas?" Josiah asked, buying time, looking for an exit. "You ruined me," Silas spat. His eyes were wild, unhinged. "That judge in Sweetwater took my land. The banks called in my loans. Nobody will do business with a man stripped of his parental rights in open court. I'm a laughingstock." Silas took a step closer. The gaslight caught the crazy glint in his eye. "You took my property," Silas snarled, looking at Clara. "You took my name. So I followed you. Figured I'd take everything from you." Josiah planted his feet. He was ready to draw. He knew he might take a bullet, but he had to drop Silas before the man could aim at Abby. "You don't want to do this, Silas," Josiah said it. "I really do," Silas grinned, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Drop the weapon, Montgomery." The shout didn't come from Josiah. It came from behind Silas. Two men stepped out of a recessed doorway in the alley. They wore dark suits. They held Winchester rifles, leveled dead at Silas's chest. Badges gleamed on their lapels. "United States Marshals." Silas froze. He looked over his shoulder. "Drop the gun now," Lead Marshal barked. Silas' hand shook. He slowly lowered the revolver. It clattered onto the cobblestones. The marshals moved in fast. One kicked the gun away. The other slammed Silas against the brick wall, pulling his arms behind his back and slapping heavy iron cuffs on his wrists. Josiah let out a breath. He felt like he'd been holding for a year. He turned and pulled Abby and Clara into a tight embrace. Silas thrashed against the brick wall. "What is this? You following me? This is a local dispute in Wyoming. You feds have no jurisdiction over a custody fight." The lead marshal walked up to Silas. He looked at this disgraced rancher with pure disgust. "We aren't here for the baby, Montgomery," the marshal said, "though that was the tip we needed to look into your books." Silas stopped thrashing. A look of real fear finally crossed his face. "We've been tracking a ring of men moving young women across lines," the marshal stated, "selling them, trading them to mining camps. We found the ledgers in your ranch house after the bank seized it. You've been treating women like cattle for a decade." Abby gasped. She thought of Cora. She thought of all the other Coras out there who didn't have someone to run into the snow with their babies. The marshal grabbed Silas by the collar of his dirty coat. He yanked him around so they were face to face. "You listen to me, Montgomery, and you listen good," the marshal said, his voice echoing in the damp alley. "You thought you owned people. You thought women were just property to be traded, used, and discarded. You thought your money made you a king." The marshal shoved Silas toward his partner. "But the law is catching up to morality," the marshal declared loudly, ensuring Josiah and Abby heard every word. "The era where men like you could use your wealth to trample on the human rights of women is over. Equality is coming for you, Montgomery, and you are going to rot in a federal cell for the rest of your miserable life." Silas didn't say a word. The arrogance was gone. The fight was gone. He was finally a broken man. The marshals dragged him down the alley, disappearing into the thick Boston fog. Josiah turned back to Abby. He rested his forehead against hers. They were shaking. The shadows were gone. Silas was gone. The fear was gone. We're safe, Josiah whispered into the dark. We're finally safe. Abby closed her eyes. She listened to the distant sound of the city. She listened to Clara, breathing softly against her chest. Take us home, Joe, Abby said. Take us back to Wyoming. 2 years later, 1880. The Sweetwater Ridge didn't look like a town built on cruel rumors anymore. It looked like a town built on a future. The Sterling Ranch had changed. It wasn't just a cattle operation now. It was a sanctuary. It was a late summer evening. The air was warm, smelling of pine needles and sweet grass. The crickets were starting their nightly song. Josiah sat on the edge of the wraparound porch. His boots were dusty. His hands were calloused, but his face was at peace. The deep lines of sorrow that used to frame his eyes had smoothed out. He was watching the yard. Down near the river, a large, newly built timber building stood tall. A wooden sign hung above the door, the Sterling House of Learning. It was a proper schoolhouse, filled with desks, chalkboards, and books shipped all the way from Chicago, and running it, standing on the steps talking to a group of local farmers, was Thomas. He had come west a year ago. Ruth had stayed in Boston, finding her own peace, but Thomas wanted to know his father. The anger had cooled. They were building something new. They worked side by side. Thomas had Josiah's eyes, but he had Abby's patience when it came to teaching the restless frontier kids. Further up the hill, nestled in a grove of cottonwood trees, was another new building, the safe haven. Abby had used Josiah's money and her own iron will to build it. It was a house for women who needed to run, women who were told they were property, women who had bruises they hid under long sleeves. Word had spread. They came from Cheyenne. They came from Denver. Abby took them all in. She gave them a bed. She gave them a job. Most importantly, she gave them their dignity back. Josiah smiled as he watched Thomas wave to the farmers and head up toward the main house. The screen door slapped shut. Abby walked out onto the porch. She was carrying a tray with 2 glasses of iced tea. She wore a simple, light blue dress. Her hair was loose, catching the golden evening light. She looked beautiful, strong, free. Running ahead of her was a blur of energy. Papa! Clara, now almost 3 years old, launched herself at Josiah. She was a whirlwind of dark curls and missing teeth. Josiah caught her easily, swinging her up into the air. Clara squealed with laughter, the sound echoing across the quiet ranch yard. Whoa there, little calf. Josiah laughed, settling her onto his knee. You're running faster than my best quarter horse. Abby set the tray down on a small wooden table. She sat in the rocking chair next to him. She handed him a glass of cold tea. She wore out the dogs. Abby smiled, and she nearly wore out Thomas trying to get him to read her that storybook again. Josiah kissed the top of Clara's head. She has got a hungry mind, like her mother. Abby leaned back in her chair. She looked out over the ranch. The setting sun painted the Wyoming sky in brilliant shades of pink, gold, and deep purple. It was a sky that looked like it went on forever. It's quiet tonight, Josiah noted, taking a sip of the sweet tea. A good quiet, Abby agreed. They watched as the lanterns flickered on inside the safe haven up the hill. Shadows moved across the windows. Women cooking dinner together. Women laughing. Women healing. Josiah reached out and took Abby's hand. He traced the gold band on her finger. I was thinking about the day Silas rode into the yard, Josiah said softly. The day he threatened to take her. Abby didn't flinch at the name. It didn't hold power over her anymore. Silas was locked away in a federal penitentiary. He was a ghost. I remember, Abby said. Folks in town used to say blood is the only thing that matters, Ghost continued. looking at Clara, who's now busy trying to braid the fringe on his leather vest. They used to say a man is tied to his blood, and that gives him ownership. It's what drove me to run from Thomas. It's what made Silas think he could take this little girl. Josiah looked at Abby. His eyes were full of a quiet, profound reverence. You proved them wrong, Abby, he said. You proved the whole damn territory wrong. Abby squeezed his hand. She looked out at the vast, open land. Then she looked at her husband and at the beautiful, happy child sitting on his knee. She needed to say it out loud. She needed the words to ring out into the evening air, to settle into the soil of the ranch they had built together. They were fools, Joe, Abby said, her voice clear and strong. It wasn't a whisper. It was a declaration. Love doesn't come from sharing the same blood, Abby stated, the educational truth ringing with absolute conviction. Blood is just an accident of birth. It doesn't make you a father. It doesn't make you a mother. Family is a choice we make every single day. We choose to show up. We choose to protect each other. Clara looked up, her big dark eyes watching Abby's face. She didn't understand all the words, but she understood the tone. She reached out and patted Abby's cheek. Abby smiled, leaning into the small hand. And as for the rest of it, Abby continued, looking back to Josiah. The laws. The men who think they own the world, they will fade, because only when humanity learns to respect the dignity of every person, regardless of where they come from or who their father was, will we all truly be free. Human rights aren't granted by a judge's gavel, Joe. They are claimed by people brave enough to stand in the light. Josiah slowly nodded. He lifted her hand and kissed her knuckles. You're the bravest person I know, Abigail Sterling, he whispered. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, taking the heat of the day with it. The first stars began to prick through the darkening purple sky, bright, unyielding. Down at the end of the porch, sitting in the shadows, was a piece of carved mahogany. The wooden cradle. Clara was too big for it now, but Josiah hadn't put it in the barn. He kept it on the porch. Currently, nestled in the sheepskin blankets, was a tiny newborn boy. He belonged to a young woman named Sarah, who had arrived at the safe haven 3 weeks ago with a bruised face and no money. Abby had taken her in, just like Josiah had taken Abby in. The cycle of violence had been broken. A new cycle had begun, a cycle of grace. Josiah put his arm around his wife's shoulders. Clara curled up against his chest, her eyes growing heavy with sleep. They sat together on the porch, listening to the crickets, looking at the stars. They were a family, forged not by old laws or shared blood, but by a quiet, unbreakable courage. And under the vast, open Wyoming sky, they were finally, completely free.
As the sun sets over the vast, unforgiving Texas prairie, the dust slowly settles, and the silence of the ranch feels heavy yet sacred. Eleanor Vance, once only a cook, has shown that courage is not measured by size or weapon, but by the heart and steadfast resolve. She has faced bullets, blood, betrayal, and even the impossible challenge of confronting family, and yet she stood unwavering. The story reminds us that true strength often comes in quiet, unexpected forms, through patience, skill, and the willingness to act for the sake of others. In the harsh expanse of the West, where every choice can mean life or death, Eleanor's actions teach us that bravery is inseparable from compassion, that justice cannot be selective, and that loyalty to family must never override morality and human decency. This tale also speaks to the power of sacrifice and responsibility. Gideon Thorne, burdened by debts, the welfare of his ranch, and the safety of his men, reveals that true leadership is measured not by dominance, but by the care for others, even when it comes at personal cost. Caleb's eyes open to the depth of his father's legacy, not the cattle, the land, or the wealth, but the lives preserved, the trust earned, and the dignity restored. The story tells us that the richest inheritance is not material. It is the impact we have on those around us, the courage to protect the innocent, and the wisdom to act with fairness even when it is difficult. And perhaps most importantly, this story teaches that heroism can reside in anyone who chooses to act with conviction. Eleanor, a woman with scars both seen and hidden, reminds us that ordinary people can perform extraordinary deeds when guided by empathy, intelligence, and courage. Life is rarely fair, and the world may throw unthinkable trials in our path. Yet what defines us is not the pain we endure, but how we rise to meet it, how we defend the weak, and how we make choices that honor justice and humanity. As we close this chapter of the Red Dust, Texas Frontier, remember that the West is more than gunfights and dusty trails. It is a landscape where courage, sacrifice, love, and moral conviction shape the destiny of all who walk it. Eleanor's story is a testament to the enduring power of human strength and compassion, the quiet, relentless force that can heal, protect, and inspire. Let it remind us that standing up for what is right, even when no one else will, is the truest measure of a person. The characters, settings, and events portrayed in this story are entirely fictional. While certain themes may echo real-life experiences, they are shaped by creative interpretation. The author does not intend to represent or depict any specific individual, organization, or historical event.